Hello and welcome to the Unsung Sport podcast, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the sports you love. Today I'm joined by ex-Liverpool and Everton sports scientist James Malone. James, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark, for having me on.
No problem. And look, before we get into the sports science questions, I have to ask, are you a red or a blue?
I am actually a very big Liverpool fan, although I did start my career, as you say, it was actually at Everton, so I was on the blue side first and then crossed over to the dark side as they saw it. But my dad's a season ticket holder on the Cop, so when I very rarely get a ticket from either him or his mate, then I try and go to the games.
Yeah, and I've got to ask this one as well because obviously it was the Liverpool City derby the other day. Was that a penalty at the end?
Oh yeah, clear penalty, wasn't it? Come on, let's face it, right?
Blatant penalty.
I might have a biased opinion on that, of course, but yeah, I felt it was a pen.
Yeah, you haven't as a West Ham fan. You haven't. That was a definite penalty. So City got away with one there.
Well, not for the first time in a title race, I'd say.
I'm sure there'll be a few more twists and turns, and I'm sure we can talk about Liverpool for a while. But let's get back onto sports science. So, can you give us a bit of an overview on your background and how you got involved in sports science?
Yeah, sure. So, kind of started my career officially back in 2006. So I did my undergraduate at Liverpool John Moores University. From that, I kind of stayed on there and did a master's as well. And then around about that time was when I first started working in football. So my third year of my undergrad, I did a placement at Blackburn Academy. So that was my first kind of exposure into the game. And then during my master's year, I was lucky enough to get a part-time internship working with the first team under David Moyes, who's obviously your manager now. But, back in the glory days when Everton were doing pretty well. So, for me, that was a real sort of eye-opening season. And then following that period, there was an advert for basically a funded PhD where you actually worked at the club as well at Liverpool. So managed to get that one alongside another colleague. So there was basically two of us as PhD students, but my job was full-time essentially at the club. So I was doing a PhD full-time, which is a lot in itself, but then I also was working 50, 60 hours a week in the club with the first team. So yeah, kind of did that for 3 years, 3 seasons, then finished my PhD and qualified as a doctor, not a proper doctor, but a doctor of philosophy. And then from that, I worked at the company called Catapult Sports, who do the little GPS pods you probably see in games and training. I was the kind of first employee for them in Europe, so I basically travelled around to all sort of major football and other sporting teams across Europe. So did that for 3 years and then had enough of travelling and then decided I wanted a nice, safe and steady academic job. So that's been me for the last 7 and a bit years now, is working full-time as a lecturer, doing research, and on the side I also do consulting and mentoring as well.
Yeah, I mean talking about those Catapult clips, and yeah, it's not an advert of Catapult, of course, but I mean everybody wears them now, don't they? It's like pretty much every club has some sort of GPS on their vests.
Yeah, I mean when I first started out, so when I was at Everton, when the tech was a bit more rudimentary back then, it was a little bit of a challenge actually to get the players to wear it. So back then, they wore maybe heart rate at a push, and there was nothing else they really had to monitor. So it was, there was some interesting stories of, I remember particularly one player who decided to steal all of the system one day and hide it at the training ground just to annoy me. So they were very much against wearing it and they try and avoid it as much as they can. Even at Liverpool, we kind of had an initial phase of opposition towards it, and then towards the end of my sort of tenure there, the players almost, as they do now, they treat it as, putting on the socks or just part of the kit. They don't have to think twice about it. Whereas when I first started, I would literally be chasing players across the training ground or out onto the training pitch as the session was starting.
Yeah, is that because some of those players are one-way players? We've all played with those.
I think age was a big factor. So you were dealing with guys in the late 20s to early 30s, and you get the classic sort of, oh, I've managed to have a good career without it so far, why do I need it now? And then I think what's happened is the younger guys, the players coming through the academy, were starting to wear it. so that when they went to the first team, it wasn't a big issue because they've been wearing it for 8 years as an academy player already.
And so, coming back to your time at Everton and Liverpool, what does a typical day look like for a sports scientist within a Premier League? And his first team, wasn't it? He was first team club.
Yeah, so both my sort of roles were first team. Yeah, I mean, it can vary. So it depends, obviously, on how congested the fixture schedule is and things like travel, etc. But, you know, typically in a normal training week, you've got maybe 4 pitch sessions a week. So we kind of periodise it. So some days are harder than others. Alongside that, we'd maybe have two team gym sessions plus some individual stuff with players. And then sort of post-game, so in the day or two following the previous fixture, we'd have a particular recovery session for the starting players or those who played a lot of minutes. So, yeah, through the week, you'd have kind of that mix of different days. So some days where you do quite a lot, where you've got, you know, either single or double pitch sessions plus a gym session. Other days, like a recovery day, is quite a quiet day in the week just to get that boxed off. But you kind of in most days, to be honest. So days off are quite a rare event in first team.
Yeah. And who was the best trainer at Liverpool?
I mean, during my time there, so, I mean, it's a long time ago now, but we had the likes of Luis Suarez, who was there, who was, you know, obviously unbelievable, as you can imagine. Steven Gerrard, absolutely unbelievable as well. But yeah, we kind of had quite a high calibre of standard, as you can imagine. And I think as people like Stephen and people put in their autobiographies about new players coming in, they always test them out early, you know, these sort of new signings, and either with a hard pass or a rough tackle. And, you know, I've seen that happen to quite a few of them and they've just crumbled under the pressure. It's safe to say that Louis was one that managed to get through that process.
Fair enough. And we were talking just before you come on, just around the definition of a sports scientist, because it is one of those jobs that seems to touch upon so many different aspects within a club. How would you define sports science?
Yeah, I think in a football context, it's really changed the last 5 years or so, because, you know, as we were speaking about a little bit earlier off the camera, when I first started out, it was pretty much you did everything. So you'd have a sports scientist or fitness coach or physical coach, as it's called, who essentially did everything. So you would be the fitness guy, you would be the data guy, sports nutrition would fall under your remit quite a lot, even a bit of sports psychology to an extent. So you were kind of doing 4 or 5 roles encompassed into one. Whereas these days, especially at the top teams, you've got each of those roles split into specialised positions. So, you know, nutrition's a great example. Actually, where back when I started, it was very much a part-time role. So you had like maybe only 1 or 2 sort of main nutritionists in the UK who would work with a number of clubs. So you'd have maybe, you know, part-time hours essentially. So we had a guy who came in sort of 2 or 3 times a month, and that was it. These days you've got full-time staff who are just in charge of nutrition. So, you know, it kind of shows that the investment has increased as in terms of sports science. But something that we always debate even recently is, you know, sometimes having too many cooks in the kitchen can actually be a negative, and that's kind of something the community are debating a little bit at the moment.
Sports nutrition is always an interesting one, because you think, obviously, certainly with the Premier League, there's so many nationalities, and, you know, as a Brit, you grow up on, well, I grew up on baked beans, potatoes, and you know, things, you know, very bland kind of food. But how does that kind of work? Trying to convince people from just very different, not countries, continents, to kind of eat. Is it eating like an English way, or is there how does that look like in terms of a club?
Yeah, I think the cultural aspect's huge. So a good example of this is actually right now we've got Ramadan, which has just started. So for those sort of Muslim players who would be adhering to that, you know, huge practical issues from a science standpoint, because they're obviously fasting through the majority of the day, typically when the training session would occur, and potentially the match as well, which is more important. So you kind of got to work around that. So you've got the kind of very early sort of meal, which you've got to get in your body at like, you know, 5 a.m. in the morning. And then you've got the sort of late evening meal when you break the fast at the end of the day. So, you know, something like that, you can't, you know, it's a religious event. It's nothing you can do to intervene. It's just about trying to work around that and trying to use science a little bit to guide some good practice there. And then, anecdotally, some of the players I work with, so like quite a lot of the sort of Spanish, Italian culture is eating late at night. So you've probably seen yourself, if you go on holiday, they're eating dinner at 10 p.m. and, chain smoking and the cafes and eating croissants at 11 p.m. at night. So that's kind of a cultural thing again. So you can try and educate, but if that's ingrained into you as a person, it's very difficult to really change that behaviour. So again, it's trying to maybe, minimise or impact slightly the way they do that. So, for example, if they are eating late, maybe a bit of education about carbohydrate intake and the fact that if they're having too much of it, it might lead to conversion into fat, which is not a good thing most of the time.
I mean, fasting is an interesting one anyway, because I think there's a lot of talk about intermittent fasting, but would that be something that's good for an athlete, or would you advise against it?
For an athlete, no, not at all. So I think the intermittent fasting thing has took off mainly due to social media. So Joe Rogan was kind of the big guy who was pushing it on his podcast, and that's obviously led to a few others who have jumped on it. It has a little bit of science behind it in terms of switching on certain mechanisms in the body, but obviously the key reason for it is restriction of eating. So I guess in a way similar to Ramadan, in a sense, you've only got that smaller window to take on board calories. So if you're trying to lose weight, it could be a decent strategy for you to try and limit all of those snacking opportunities that you normally have, particularly sort of late at night, I would say, is the big one. A big downside to intermittent fasting is actually the skipping of breakfast. So as we know, protein is really important for building muscle. So if you skip your breakfast following an overnight fast when you're asleep, that's going to just lead to more reduction of muscle. So again, that's something okay maybe for general public, but in terms of an athletic population, it's not one that we'd recommend.
The role of kind of sports science in enhancing athletic performance, again, we say it's quite a big topic, but can you talk us through that, the enhancement of athletic performance? Yeah,
I think, again, to use football as an example, but you can see now, firstly, the data, so the speed, not as much the distance covered a little bit, but mostly the speed data. So higher speed distances has increased over the last decade. So that's obviously been an impact from the better preparation strategies through science. We're seeing players. I mean, Cristiano Ronaldo is obviously the kind of freak in the data who's playing at still at a good level at 40 nearly. But the days of retiring at 33 are gone pretty much. So players are playing a lot longer into the 30s now, and again, that's all off the back of science and better preparation of people's bodies. So I think that's kind of the impact side of it, which people can see the tangible benefit. And then obviously behind that, you've got all of those sort of different areas I mentioned before. So whether it's nutrition, how we train, the stuff we do in the gym, injury prevention, all of those are just parts of the puzzle that we try and piece together to make people better.
And a word that I do hear a lot within sports science is biomechanics. Could you kind of talk about the importance of that within sports science?
Yeah, I mean, of the disciplines, it's probably the one that is not looked down on. I shouldn't say that when I've got colleagues in the area, but it's the one that's probably the hardest to learn as a student, to be honest. It's one that I always struggle with personally, and it's then kind of led to it not being as adopted in practice. So in some sports, like your cricket, badminton, maybe stuff like that, which is really sort of technical in that regard, you see a lot more of that implemented. In football, we can still use it, particularly for gait analysis, so understanding a person's running technique, or we can use force plates in the lab as well to look at some interesting stuff there. But at a practical standpoint, the issue is a lot of it is in the lab traditionally, so it's hard to get 30 footballers into a lab to do some proper testing. So last few years, there's more wearable technology that's being used in the field, so we are starting to use that a lot more in the gym, for example. But I would say, of the disciplines, it's probably not as popular as, say, physiology or psychology.
You touched upon actually my next question, which is around that kind of data side and technology. And it's interesting you say like the lab, because again, the preconception I have is there's you working in the gym, take off the wearables, and then analyze the data on a computer. But how does that actually work?
Yeah, so to use, say, the GPS as an example, so when I first started, it would take forever. So the devices were terrible. You would take forever to connect into the box and then download and get your reports out. That could take anywhere between 2 to 3 hours sometimes. These days, the companies realise that time is of the essence. So what they do now is they pretty much, as soon as you finish, it's super quick now to get that data from the system, the device into the software, and all of the reporting mechanisms off the back of it is all automated. And obviously AI is come into the fore as well. So you're getting the insights generated directly through AI as well. So all in all, the speed and the process is super quick, which is really important actually, because in football in particular, you do your training, you might do a gym session afterwards, then some players will stick around for lunch. Most of them will decide to just scarper straight away. So by the time you've collected your data and analysed it, there's such a small window to feed back on that day with the athlete. So it's all about speed and trying to get it across.
Interesting as well. You say the obviously the young lads at the end of the day. So once the work's done, they're out of there. I could kind of understand that. But when do you pull them back in? Do you have it like a performance analyst meeting where you'd get them all in a room and talk through that data, or is it much more one-to-one?
It's a little bit of both. So what would happen in a football club is essentially you'd get that sort of post-training or post-day reflection. So looking through your data set, looking at any players who've got maybe red flags against the name, checking everyone's kind of in the range that you want them to be. Now, if you've kind of flagged them, obviously, like say, sometimes it's difficult to do something about it on that day later on. So the next day or the next morning is typically when you'll have the medical meeting. So the sports science and medical staff will meet together. From that, there'll then be typically the head of performance would be the person to then sit in with the coaches meeting before training. So they will take all of that medical information, put it in a simple message, and then take that to the coaches directly. They can then decide if they want to manipulate the day. So maybe that might be either, maybe reducing the load for a particular athlete, or, very rarely we try and take players out of training because it just annoys everyone, to be honest, both the player and the coach. So it's more about subtle modifications in the drills or just anything to maybe preserve what they're doing that day. So that's kind of a typical, I guess, feedback loop, I would say. But the thing is, these days, the data, it's all live as well. So you can see everything in real time. So rather than wait until post-training, you can just make some decisions right on the spot.
Has there ever been a time when there's been a disagreement between a player and a medical department? I'll call it as a whole, but not to single anyone out. But has there ever been a time where a player has wanted to play on, but actually the data is saying you need to take a rest?
Yeah, 100% happens weekly in most clubs. Yeah, I mean it's really difficult actually. So as a scientist, all you can really do is present the options or the data. So at the end of the day, if you look at it like a food chain or a chain of command, we're not at the top. We're kind of down at the bottom pretty much. So the head coach and assistant coaches, they're the ones calling the shots. They're paid the big bucks, right? Then you've got your heads of performance who are also the highly paid people, so they've also got a decision. But all we do as scientists is present the information up the funnel to then hopefully better inform what goes on. But sometimes we get either the obviously coach disagreements with what we say, player disagreements. They always say, I know my body best, or your data can just do one. So it's more about trying to get across our message the best we can, but at the same time. And I've seen some sports scientists do this, I've probably been guilty myself as well, where you think you know everything just because you've got some data. And actually you can sometimes ruin relationships with athletes if you try and push that too much. So you've got to try and pick your battles essentially through the season.
Yeah, it must be tough. Obviously, look, if it's going back to Liverpool, if there's some data saying Van Dijk needs a rest, but there's that game against Man City coming up, it's going to be very hard to say, like a manager just needs a certain player. You don't want to put him at too much risk, but obviously there's, that the results are so important.
Yeah, so they're the factors, aren't they? If it's cup finals, big games, you just got to go for it, right, and risk and hope that nothing happens. Liverpool are probably a great example at the moment this season, where you're pretty much at the bare bones with academy players stepping in at times, and I actually think the manager has rotated it as best as he could. Giving players, half games, even the centre halves, giving them half games and flipping them. So it's just some things are unlucky. We've got Curtis Jones, Ryan Gravenberch, who both just got absolutely clattered into. There's not really anything you can do about that. So it's just trying to keep the availability up the best you can. But as Liverpool showed, sometimes we have these re-injuries as well, which can be an issue.
Curtis Jones, what a player, by the way. I think he's quality. Really good.
He's getting there. I wasn't sure about him at the start, but he's finally found his pressing game, so I think he'll do all right now.
Yeah, some of the kids there, certainly doing Klopp some favours, so I think you'll be all right. Were there any common misconceptions around sports science?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the hierarchy of football, we're not seen as the cool people. Let's face it. So, the problem is, you've got sort of let's talk about medical staff, but you've got the doctor who's everyone trusts. You're a doctor, right? So they're kind of seen in high regard. You've got kind of physios as well. So clubs will have anywhere between sort of 4 to sort of 8 physios within the staff. Now they're actually spending a lot of time with the players in the physio room. Often in a training facility, the physio room is the sanctum. It's where the interesting conversations happen. Let's put it that way. So physios naturally have a very good relationship with players and sometimes coaches as well. And then we've got us, the scientists, who kind of sit almost below that in a sense, because we do stuff during training, we do other bits with players, but we're not contact time wise, we're not as much as some of the other roles. So then the ability to build relationship is probably lessened in that regard. So, sometimes you are seen as the data geek, or what was it some players used to call me? I used to collect blood from players. So some people used to call me Dexter, if you remember that show on the telly.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. It's all harmless, bit of fun, isn't it? But sometimes in football we are looked down on a little bit compared to some other roles.
Yeah, it's you need that banter in a club, and that's fair enough. Dexter's a good nickname. You touched upon something earlier. I just want to come back to around the psychology part as well. And again, is that something now where you would have a dedicated psychologist coming in, or is that still part of the sports science? Maybe not in Liverpool because they have the budget to have more dedicated, but even further down the food chain.
Yeah, I mean, it probably similar to nutrition, as we mentioned before, really. So originally very much a part-time consultancy role. So there was a guy at Liverpool who came in my last year there called Steve Peters, Professor Steve Peters. So he's probably one of the most famous psychologists out there now in sport. And he brought out a book, I'm not sure if you've seen it, called The Chimp Paradox Theory, which is quite popular. So he was kind of one of the early sort of people. I mean, there was definitely others before him, but he really sort of popularised a lot of sports psychology, more towards, as we know now, as performance psychology. So probably prior to that, it was seen as, your classical lie on a leather bed and tell me about, how you got bullied at school, or your mum and dad or something, Whereas actually the term performance psychology is a lot different. So it's more things like, coping strategies. So dealing with pressure, taking a penalty, dealing with abuse. So, funny enough, I rewatched the David Beckham documentary the other day on Netflix again, and you kind of forget the level of abuse that he had to put up with, around England and his wife and things like that. And obviously back then there wasn't that awareness of mental health and issues like that. So, performance psychology, it can help with performance itself, but obviously still the personal side, dealing with, family stuff or, politics around the club, etc.
And again, talking about the injury prevention side and that rehabilitation, not just prevention, but afterwards, how closely would you work with the physios and club doctors on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I mean, this again is a role that's evolving really. So traditionally, you'd have, depending on the length of the injury, you'd have kind of early, mid, and late stage rehab phases. So if you take an example like someone who's done an ACL, which is a 9-month injury, typically you've got the early phase, which is just predominantly led by the doctor, the physio, linking in with the surgeon who's probably done the surgery on them as well. And a lot of that is just about mobilization, to be honest, and just getting the body moving again. And then you kind of get to that mid stage, which again is mostly physio led, where it's trying to get them back out on the grass. We use there's loads of cool things you can use now, like anti-gravity treadmills. I'm not sure if you've seen those, but it's basically a normal treadmill, but you strap looks like a big plastic bag, to be honest, but it replicates being like in space. So you can set the treadmill to a certain percentage of your body weight. So when you do it really light, it's like jumping on the moon, essentially. But what that enables is that you can obviously progress that until they're able to deal at 100% body weight before going outside, and then obviously doing that on the grass. So yeah, and then when you get to kind of late stage rehab, that's when typically the sports science or fitness staff would link in a lot more closely. So that's where you're doing a lot more football-based drills. So starting very basic straight line stuff, moving on to more change of direction, building in a bit more speed work, and then kind of leading into the last phase, which is, full football drills. So getting them to, as we call them, do a match simulation. So can they do what they've done previously? And that's where the data comes in really handy. So we've got data sets for each player when they're healthy, prior to injury, and then all the way through the rehab process, we're constantly checking back to that reference point to see, how far off are they before we can give them the green light to the coach and say, right, you're ready to return to team training.
Yeah. What are some of those key factors to consider when assessing an athlete's ability to return?
Some objective markers. So we'll do, the physios will do their own tests. We will do some fitness testing ourselves as well. And obviously gym, we can do some pretty easy gym measures as well. But there's also the subjective side. A lot of the time it's asking, do you feel pain? So when we do a session, maybe it's the first time they do change of direction as part of the rehab. The worry is then they'll have this flare up and constantly be in pain in the days following. So obviously usually a good indicator they're doing okay is when the pain isn't too bad or not at all. So that's kind of, a combination of the objective data plus the, players' feeling of how the body's reacting as well.
And I have to ask, have you had a go on that zero gravity treadmill yourself?
Unfortunately, I have, yes. So I did my knee playing, when I was at Melwood, actually. I was playing five-a-side with the staff and tweaked my MCL. So yeah, I had to program my own rehab and get myself on there, to be honest.
Yeah, to be fair, it's not a bad recovery, though, playing five-a-side. There's not many five-a-side players that I guess would have those facilities to recover.
Well, this is it, yeah. Now, these days, I'm just like Joe Bloggs and got to go through the NHS and take 4 years to get an appointment.
Fair enough. And within sports science, how do you help with the kind of tailoring of training programs for individual players?
Yeah, so in football in particular, it's mostly coach-led. So 80-90% of the content is predetermined by the coach, really. So there is those little windows through the week where the fitness staff would have a little bit more say in what happens. So typically on we call it sort of a match day -4, which refers to 4 days before the game. So that's for most teams the big day of the week of training in a normal week. So typically within that, maybe 70 to 80 minute session, we would get a segment of that to do some conditioning drills. So maybe 10-15 minutes worth of, for example, aerobic conditioning or repeated sprint stuff, something which is going to give the players a little bit of a blow. But then as we get through the weekend season, particularly sort of match day -1 and 2, we can't do too much because we might carry fatigue into the next game. So unless we have a normal sort of Saturday to Saturday week, there's not really much scope as soon as we go to 2 and 3 game weeks, because your starters are basically just recovering game to game, and your non-starters, even though they don't play, if you beast them in training between the games, and then suddenly they've got to start the next one, again they're going to carry fatigue into it, so it can be a bit of an issue practically.
Yeah, as I say, actually, with a club like Liverpool that probably won't have many opportunities for a -4. West Ham will have a few, but not at Liverpool.
No, I think was it like 6 games or something in God knows how in a couple of weeks now. It's and in cup finals and things like that. So it's yeah, and the thing is though, players do get into routine with it. So some players actually are really capable of just playing week in week out. But then you've got certain players like in Liverpool, you've got Kanate, the central defender, who has to be rotated because for whatever reason it seems like his body can't cope with that volume of games. Whereas you've got Virgil van Dijk who can just keep going, every game pretty much.
What's the most challenging part of the job?
Probably the buy-in aspect, I would say. Coming back to our earlier point about the hierarchy and how people perceive you. So when I was at Everton, we used to collect the GPS. Well, I used to collect the GPS on the side of the pitch, and at Finch Farm, there's sort of there's a couple of main pitches, but there's a little slope down where the entrance to the training ground is, the training pitches. And I used to be there with a almost like a box with the computer on and GPS antenna, and players would just take turns pinging balls at me, trying to destroy either my face or the laptop, essentially. And, back then I was an intern, so that's kind of what you do. But, it's not too uncommon for things like that to occur with a sports scientist. So, yeah, I think getting buy-in is the big part of the job, and building personal connection as well. So the problem or the difficulty I had is when I was at Liverpool is I was about, 22, 23 at the time. So, I was dealing with players some of them were in the, low 30s. Some of them had, had kids at like 5 kids at 23. So like to get that engagement, that conversations is quite difficult. And I actually obviously naturally got on better with the younger players. Whereas if I went in now as a 35-year-old of kids myself, then I think that changes the conversations that you have with people, that maturity. So, I know a lot of young sports scientists do struggle with that buy-in and getting part of the culture.
I'll touch on that in a bit, actually, with a question. But I just want to ask it as well, because you touched upon AI earlier. I mean, are there any other emerging trends within sports science that are having a big impact? I mean, how AI is quite new, of course, but we're all hearing about it. Is that the biggest change coming?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, even with that AI and things like that, it's there, but not many people probably use it well so far. So the thing about AI is it's not accurate enough just yet. So as with all machine-based models, you've got to keep feeding it information so that it gets better and it learns. So maybe in a few years' time, we'll see the true benefit of these things. But for example, you get a lot of companies now offering a AI-based injury prediction service. So the idea behind that is they can look at your training data, etc., model it through the system, and then give you a bit of a rating or a injury risk score for each of your players. So what we found, though, based on research as well, is that it's impossible to predict injury. So we know certain things are risk factors. So we know that doing too much sprint distance or too much volume in a short space of time is a bad thing. But not one person or AI model can say, right, on Tuesday at 2 p.m, you're going to pull your hamstring. So this is where I think things are changing or technology is improving, but the decision making is maybe still not really advancing that much.
And you've moved away from, I think Liverpool was your last Premier League club. Then, as you say, you went to Catapult and then moved back into teaching. So you got your masters and then went back, and now you're teaching others.
Yeah, I guess my role at Catapult was a really interesting one, actually. So I kind of had a few offers to stay in football after Liverpool, but I spoke to Catapult was a company that I'd done some work with, and they were an Australian company, so they were just expanding into the UK and Europe at the time. So I was to be the first UK employee of the company, and the remit was essentially here's a budget, get business and go for it. So I was quite sort of interested by that. So there was a lot of travel involved. So I think over my 3.5 years there, I think I went to about sort of 30 countries in total, 35 countries around the world, mostly in Europe, but we did stuff in America, went to Australia a few times, did some stuff in Asia as well. So, you know, you kind of, for me, it was a great experience just for seeing the world and obviously not having to pay for it. So, which is always good. But the great part of that, so when you're working for a club, there's always that little bit of, so if I asked someone to go and meet them somewhere, especially if you're in the same league, there's that sort of rivalry. Whereas working for Catapult, I was a neutral body. So I was able to go to pretty much all the top football teams in Europe's training grounds and speak to those people, see what they do, watch training, and really build a solid network for my career. So, you know, things like we were the first people to bring GPS to Borussia Dortmund. If you just in my last year there, and spending a week with them on the training camp, and you know, working with some of the top players there, that was a great experience. And but yeah, following that kind of 3.5 years of crazy travel, and my wife was a bit like, come on, let's. I'm sick of not seeing you on a weekend, or you're too knackered on a weekend to do stuff. So kind of went. I was 27, I think, at the time. Went into academia, probably a bit earlier than I really wanted, to be honest. I thought it not sounding bad, but it's a bit of an old man's game, because it is the classical, you know, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 steady job, which in performance sport it's the complete opposite. So yeah, I've done it for a while now. But I guess the good thing with what I do is I get to still work with teams. So doing research, doing consultancy, or I do a lot of mentorship as well with individual practitioners.
Yeah, I guess working 9 to 5, you get to go and watch football more leisurely as well.
Yeah. I mean, like I said before, luckily I've get the odd ticket to games at Anfield, but it's not very easy to get a ticket at the match these days. And but yeah, it just affords a lot more time. I think weekends you've got, I've got a little baby at home, so I get to spend a lot of time with her as well. So yeah, I think it's a good career move, and a lot of football people I speak to, actually, when they get to about 25 plus, they've done it for maybe 5 or 6 years. A lot of them actually want to come out of it like I've done, because they realise the money is actually not that great, and also the hours are crazy. So I think once that initial football bug wears off, they start thinking more long term about family and stability, etc.
And obviously, is it John Moore University? You're in academia there, but you're also doing some mentoring as well. Is that right?
Yeah, so I basically work full time as a lecturer. It's actually Liverpool Hope Uni, which is a just down the road from John Moore's actually. So yeah, do sort of full time there, but also alongside that I do, like say, the mentorship. So I've mainly worked with a small group of people the last sort of 4 or 5 years with this, and then probably the last 12 to 18 months it's really kind of grown. So there's, you know, a lot of practitioners out there who feel almost isolated, so, you know, they're kind of stuck in the day-to-day working in the clubs, and a lot of the time they just want to get some either practical advice about something sciencey, or more often than not it's more the personal stuff. And, you know, because I've kind of been through that journey and I've tried different things, I'm hoping that I can kind of pass on that experience to the younger generation.
Excellent. So people wanted to find out more and get in touch with you, where should they reach out to you online?
Probably, I mean, I do have a website, which is maloneperformance.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn in particular. So I'd probably say if you check out my LinkedIn, so just search my name on LinkedIn, and there are some links on my profile which will lead to things like my new mentorship community, which I've just launched in a couple of weeks ago. So I am trying to get into Instagram, but I'm struggling, to be honest. I'm just not very good at creating graphics. I think I need to employ someone to do it, to be honest.
But look, James, I've learned a lot. So thank you very much for your time today and for being an unsung hero of sport. I wish you all the very best of luck with your course, and we'll put all of the information about how people can reach you in the description.
Yeah, spot on, Mark. No, thanks very much for having me.
Cheers, buddy. Speak soon.